So, you want to design a video game. You're sitting down with a blank screen on your computer and just a vague idea. You want to make a platformer game with puzzles about rewinding time. In order to make anything, you need answers to some fundamental questions. It's a platformer. Who's the character? Human or some kind of animal mascot? How big is he? How fast does he move? What's the scale of the world? How big are levels horizontally and vertically? How much can you see on the screen at once? You can change your answers later, but before you can start building levels, you need an initial guess. And this initial guess is important because it determines how development is going to go. If you guess too wrong, you might never see the ideas that lead to the best version of your game because the territory you're exploring is too far from those ideas. Okay, anyway, we're making Braid. It's a puzzle platformer starring a human guy, and we want moving and jumping to feel good. What does that mean for the shape of the character? I knew based on experience playing other platformers that I wanted him to be fairly squat so that he would fit into a compact rectangle on the screen that was not too tall and thin. After some initial experimentation, I came up with the answer that the character should be around 2.5 heads tall. Adult humans tend to be between 7 and 8 heads tall, so this is much shorter. This convention of measuring characters in number of heads is something that illustrators have been using for a long time, and I'd become aware of it in some way or another. So I wanted a squat character, more like Mario from Super Mario Bros., and less like the humanish proportions of a classic game from my childhood, like Impossible Mission. Why did I want such a squat character? The reason is, you're trying to aim this shape through space to avoid obstacles and land on platforms and on top of moving monsters. When do you land and when do you miss? As a player, how do you aim your jump? If the character shape is too tall and thin, like adult natural human proportions, the segment between the feet is going to be narrow compared to the height of the character. And it's hard to aim this narrow segment precisely to target other objects in the game. The wider this segment is, the easier and more natural it is to hit things with it. If the character is very tall, he's going to bump his head a lot more on ceilings, which is bad. And if the baseline is pretty wide while he's tall, then he's going to take up an appreciable portion of the screen. His jump height will include so much of the screen that it limits what you can see at once, which makes puzzles harder. Also, if you're much taller than wide, it means a lot of the action of the game will involve hitting ledges from the side. But we don't want that because it's awkward in a game like this. All the important interactions in this game are vertical in nature. Did you land on top of the platform? Did you land on top of the monster? So if we make you tall and your baseline narrow, we amplify the kinds of clumsy interactions we don't want and reduce the kinds of interactions we do want. It wasn't a mistake that the characters from Donkey Kong and Mario Bros. Were very squat, because the designers of those games thought about these things. We were happy to follow in this tradition because it works well. Now, what about the actual motion? How high do you jump, and how quickly do you move through the air? These are important topics, and I cover them elsewhere. Fortunately, when making Braid, the important parameters about game mechanics were understood early on, and early decisions didn't have to be changed too much because they were in the right neighborhood. Braid's startup behavior was unusual at the time, and remains so even today. When Braid starts up, it drops you straight into gameplay, in a level which also serves as the title screen, but is playable. Then, as now, most video games displayed one or more splash screens presenting developer or publisher logos. Then they take you to a main menu where you can choose to start a game. Then maybe you get to pick some options, and this is often pointless because you don't really know what to pick because you haven't played the game yet, so you don't really know what the options are going to do. Then you pick a save slot, and so forth. Why are you making me choose a save slot when the 3 choices are all the same because they're all empty and this is the first time I ever started the game? Someday, eventually, the game might actually let you play it. I strongly disliked splash screens because I feel they damage the posture of the game as a thing meant to give good things to the player. The reasons for this can get complicated, so here's a separate explanation over here. But just from a basic standpoint of craft, trying to make the best game I could, I found all this other game launching bureaucracy very distasteful. The annoying menus had grown over time. Arcade games of the 1980s didn't have any of this. You just put in your quarter and press start. So I wanted to do my part to push back against that trend. But also, I wanted this game to have a strong focus, to feel like a carefully crafted, harmonious work, and this meant removing complications that would dilute or occlude the main experience. I wanted people to experience the heart of the game, the best that the game really had to give, not video game-like trappings like menus and splash screens. So my plan was, when you start the game, whether on PC or console, you're just in the game right away and you can start walking around. There were some design considerations. You would need to launch into a known safe place with no timed challenges or penalties in case you launched the game and went to grab a snack. But I felt that launching to an interactive title screen, which you could play immediately, was the best. And that's how it is today. I dislike video game splash screens very strongly that have flying developer logos and whatnot, and did not want one on Braid. When you're programming the game, it's easy enough just to not add such a screen, but sometimes publishers or development partners who might port the game to other platforms expect to put their own splash screen on. So every time we signed a contract, I made sure there was a no splash screen clause in there. Why do I dislike splash screens so much? Well, when designing Braid, I was working hard to give the very best experience to the player that I could, and splash screens do the opposite. They try to extract resources from the player because they're saying, hey player, while I have you captive here as the game starts up, I'm going to advertise to you to attempt to implant the name and logo of my company into your brain. We know what the player wants to do. He just wants to play the game, but we're not letting him do that yet because our advertisement comes first, even though he already paid for the game. This starts the whole relationship on poor footing, but it's even worse because any attempt the game makes to approach any deep themes, to attempt to do anything meaningful, is going to ring at least a little bit hollow because we made the game itself subservient to an advertisement. So the game can't really be that important. The splash screen disrespects the game that comes after it, and it disrespects video games as an art form. It says, this so-called art form is really just a vehicle for companies that want to make money. Since one of my priorities in making Braid was to show that games can be treated as an artistic medium without reservation, I was very sensitive to this kind of issue. Now, hey, I admit that I feel more strongly about this than just about anyone, in such a way that most people probably don't even know what I'm talking about here. People might say, oh, the screen just lasts a few seconds, then it's gone. Then the player can have a very strong experience with your game and they'll forget about that screen. Well, if it's so unimportant, why don't we just not do them? Why are publishers so insistent on putting their company logo up? Why do game engines now insist on putting their logo up? I believe that any developer who cares deeply about their game and the way the game is experienced should grate at the appearance of such a screen. But today, almost all developers put these screens on their games without even thinking. This shows how messed up our collective judgment is societally, in my opinion. Even if you don't agree with my rather strong stance on this subject, it should be clear that, at best, these screens just slow down loading and add another layer of bureaucracy before the player can get into the game. All for something that players don't even want and don't care about. The initial motivation for this puzzle began with the vision of things being rewound very quickly. And in this game, the objects beside the player that can move of their own accord are usually hostile. They're bullets, they're monsters, rabbits, and whatnot. And so the image is of a bunch of these flying around as you rewind very quickly. And why are they flying around? Well, you could just have them flying through space that the player doesn't ever move through, but that seems weird and strange. And it just seems more fun to have the player dodge them. And I got to do a fun thing previously mentioned where you get to dodge things twice due to the geometry of the level. And anytime as a level designer that you get a chance to do something like that, it feels good. It feels interesting. And so I felt that in this particular case, it was okay to do what was mostly an action puzzle, but at the same time, I tuned it so that it was not super hard, right? It's certainly not the only exception as well. So there's, oh man, what's the level?
I want to say that Brian Moriarty specifically pointed out in one of his lectures that he was unable to complete one of the monster hunts.
Yes, but those are a little bit different. Like, those are actually trying to be just the basic puzzle, but you have to bounce off the same monster multiple times. And that could be difficult. That's more like an unavoidable reflex-based thing. But there is other stuff in the game. For example, the time when you get chased by large hordes of bunnies for a short distance and then hopefully manage to get them mostly shot by a cannon. That was also just a thing I did because it was fun. And so here's the thing about games is, like, you're allowed to make exceptions sometimes. And in fact, if you don't, maybe your thing doesn't have as much life as it would if you allow yourself to do the things that are the most fun and the most interesting at any particular time. But it can be hard to justify, like when trying to explain to somebody, like, why did you do this? I feel like that's what people are going to say about this commentary a lot. Like, you said this over here, but I can point at this thing. And it's like, yeah, there are exceptions. This is not a game of ironclad consistency everywhere. And I think that's just part of what makes it interesting. Braid is often pretty good about making relevant gameplay information visible so that the player is not confused and can successfully solve puzzles. But over the course of development, in order to design puzzles, some configurable behavior was added to some entities that was invisible. Essentially, these are hidden variables that actually matter to gameplay. I was unsure how to address these visually at the time, because the design decisions were so in flux, it seemed like they might change completely. And also, early ideas about how to visualize these pieces of information seemed heavyweight and maybe more confusing than helpful. Ultimately, these cases were left unhandled, but in retrospect, I'd like it more if I had done something there. The most impactful hidden variable is that each cannon that fires monsters has a limit of how many live monsters are permitted at one time. When that many monsters are alive, the cannon fuse will stop recharging, so the cannon will no longer fire. This matters a lot in terms of solving the puzzles, but it seemed too complex to put a visual monster counter on the cannons, and hey, I had a lot of other work to do. Actually, though, it could have been nice if the cannons displayed a monster counter in the same style as the monster gate on Hunt, with little icons on the side. Maybe when you jump on the monster, it gets crossed off and fades out. Another major piece of hidden state is that some monsters walk off the edges of platforms, but other monsters turn around and go the other way to avoid falling. There's no visual indicator of which behavior a monster has. You just have to figure it out by watching. Since this behavior matters a lot, I consider this a fundamental mistake in the game design. At the same time, this behavior difference is somewhat minor in the grand scheme of things, so we shouldn't have two totally different monsters for these two behaviors. Rather, maybe one of the monsters is wearing spectacles so he could see the edge of the ledge coming and doesn't walk off, and the other isn't. Something like that. At the time, I didn't want to add a bunch more animation work by having another monster variant, since it was just hard to get all this stuff done. But I should have done it. Braid starts up directly to this screen, and the music for this level is the first thing that players hear. I think of this opening as one of the signature moments of the game, but it's pretty different from what I originally imagined. From the start of development, I had a picture of the mood and feel I wanted the game to have that was contrary to what most games had done. Platformer games of that time were, in general, produced as commercial products with a certain kind of polish that made them feel professional, corporate, not personal, not weird. But I wanted this game to be unrestrained emotionally, heartfelt, not composed, not protecting itself, not polished in a corporate video game way. I wanted to imbue these properties into the game design, the visuals, the writing, and of course the music. My favorite band at the time was a group from Australia called the Dirty Three. who I knew about because Warren Ellis had played with Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, and I really liked the Bad Seeds and had gone through that process where you get excited and search out all the related bands that all the Bad Seeds were in and listen to whatever you can get your hands on. My favorite Dirty 3 album was called Horse Stories, and that album embodied many qualities that I wanted this game to have. I especially liked the way Warren's violin was expressive and unrestrained, completely unconcerned with precise form or coloring within the lines. In addition to being the guitarist, Mick Turner also painted most of the band's album covers, and this style of painting also served as an example of the kind of fluidity I wanted in the art style. Though the final style of Braid does not look much like Mick's art, it was still a big inspiration when it came to my part of the art process, directing the game, choosing mood, and general principles. So the picture I had was of an opening scene with striking visuals, with my favorite Dirty 3 song, Horse, playing in the background. And while I was working on the game, Horse was indeed the music on this level for a while. Here's an excerpt so you can get a feel for it. But I had doubts that I would ever be able to license a real song from a real band, how much it would cost, the legalities around it, what it might mean for the game's ability to last a long time. Even if I could afford a license, since it would have to be renewed periodically, that renewal could be denied at any time in the future, at which point the game would have to change or be removed from distribution. If I had to change the music, this could be costly, and if I couldn't afford that cost, I might have to take the game down anyway. And if I could afford it, changing the music might damage the feel of the game substantially. When you work so hard to make sure so many elements are put together just right, being forced to arbitrarily change one of those elements later is pretty terrible. Licensing music under these traditional terms feels like installing a ticking time bomb into the art that you're sweating so hard to make. I really didn't want to do that. Scouting around the internet, there was lots of music with perpetual licenses, but it was mostly low-effort session music made for commercials, radio intros and outros, and that kind of thing. It wasn't the kind of emotionally invested music that I wanted. But then I found an online music label called Magnatune that was relatively forward-thinking and that allowed for perpetual licenses. They could do this because they worked with musicians who weren't locked down by contracts with major labels. Most of these artists were less well-known, but this didn't matter to me. I was looking for good music, not big names. I realized that if I could put together a score for the game that came entirely from tracks on Magnatune, I wouldn't be creating this kind of time bomb situation. The Dirty 3 were not represented on Magnatune, but I was finding reasons not to be so fixated on that song Horse in the first place. Though as a whole piece it embodied many of the emotional qualities I wanted, mechanically speaking, I didn't think that the beginning of the song fit so well in the role where I wanted to use it. It works much better in a context where energy has already been going for a while, not from a cold start on a level like this. So I dug around Magnatune for something that started slow, that started quietly, and I found Jamie Sieber's song May Nam, which I thought was amazing and perfect for the game, even though it was nothing like Horse. May Nam is slow, full of mystery, hinting at the majesty of seeing something very large. And for simple interactivity reasons, it probably works better than Horse would have. Since this house level serves as a nexus that you might walk into and out of frequently, a song that starts very slowly is probably a good idea because it results in a less jarring change to mood. It feels less like it's coming out of nowhere and less cut off when you leave it. The mood of May Nam then helped us steer the art direction for the scene, and the end result was what you have today. Many years later, and knowing what I know today, it's clear that it may have been quite possible to call up the Dirty 3 and talk to them directly to see if such a licensing agreement was possible. But I never even tried. I was just discouraged by the whole landscape around music. The core idea of this puzzle is as follows. You need to bounce off the monster, thus killing it to get to the right-hand side where the key is. But only that monster can get the key out. So you have to find a way to resurrect the monster, which can only happen by traveling to the left, and then you have to get back across to the right in a new way that doesn't kill him. This idea is structurally parallel with the puzzle on the left. In that one, you have to reverse direction in a weird way above a switch to reset it. In this one, you have to reverse direction above a monster to reset it. Usually in Braid, when puzzles are in the same level, they have some kind of structural parallelism, even if it's vague. This puzzle on the right can be pretty rough to play, and it feels messier than it needs to. Because the puzzle on the left is also messy, these combined to make one of the messiest, and therefore maybe worst, levels in the game overall. It's messy for many reasons, but here's the biggest one. It's possible to just kill the monster right under this platform, enabling you to resurrect it with a small amount of air control just jumping in this area. Or, if you run and jump at the very edge of the leftmost platform, you can kill him under the ledge on the right, then bounce up through it so you can resurrect him just by walking in this small area. It's even possible for players to do this by mistake the first time, thereby not even realizing that there should be a more interesting puzzle here. Players don't know the intended solution to the puzzle, so it's likely they will try to get the monster back alive via trial and error with a bunch of air-controlled jumps, which will feel spammy and bad because the player keeps dying, yet there's enough positive feedback to keep going and eventually succeed. It's less likely they'd find the cleaner, intended solution first. So for many players, maybe the majority, this puzzle would feel unfun and broken. At the time, I tried to find a way to avoid this, but was unable to do so. I shipped the puzzle anyway. For the anniversary edition, I also spent time trying to revise this puzzle and also failed to really fix anything, so I've left it unchanged. There is a fundamental problem, which is that you have enough air control in this game that, even if I somehow forced you to jump on the monster way over on the left or change the geometry of the landing platform, you could revive that monster, then keep bouncing off it to the left and then air controlling right to go forward in time, then switch back to the left at the last instant for the next bounce, and by doing this repeatedly, you could walk the monster indefinitely toward the right while keeping it alive. I can't figure out a way to ensure the invariant that the monster is dead when you land on the platform. So the level is still messy in the anniversary edition. I used not to take the kind of messiness we see in this puzzle as seriously as I do today. Today, I would not find this puzzle acceptable, and I would try very hard to redesign it, making very large changes, and if I couldn't fix it, I would cut it from the game. Puzzles can really sing when they are simple and when they are clean, and now I aim for that whenever possible, in part because I know what to look for now that I have more experience. I've said many negative things about this level, but there are some good things about it. I like the weird feeling when you're running around to the right, chasing the newly freed key that you still can't reach. I like that after resurrecting the monster to get the key, you end up killing the monster again to climb up to the puzzle piece. I like that just walking toward the exit door from the beginning, you see the monster go into the tunnel not far from the key, and you see that if you could only continue rightward, he would get that key, but you're blocked here by this wall. The room up here with the puzzle piece makes a good excuse to have a higher platform from which to jump to the left. This nub on the left looks kind of like a wall or just a stopper to help bound the area, but at the same time it's obviously a flat area you can jump on, so this part of the solution feels completely fair. As I iterated toward a final puzzle design, I liked the idea that the player keeps looping through this central space in various directions. This pattern makes the puzzle a little more beautiful to me. There is a subtle piece of aesthetics that I don't think most players would notice consciously, but games are felt more strongly when these are in there. And after all, even with the unintended solution, the level did successfully embody its core idea of resetting things by crossing over them and back, though this might be hard for some players to see through the mess. This puzzle is a very clear example of partial solvability, which is nice because it gives players the hint that they're on the right track. It is not too hard to get a monster past the first two claws just by walking right to left down here on the bottom. But it's not possible to get the monster past the third plant just by walking left because you're blocked by this huge block here. If you try to climb the ladder to go over the block, it takes too long and the monster dies on the third claw. But this blockage is not too discouraging since the player has seen that it's possible and intended to get a monster past the first 2 claws, so he can try to think of how to change it up a little bit for the last one. In this case, using rewind to get up over the block more directly. There's an extra flourish for the last step in the solution. The player is likely to try rewinding up here to the block first, but the block is not wide enough to walk on it to the correct spot. So either the player has to jump across the ladder to the left of the block, which is a little bit funny, or else he can realize that where he really wants to be, ultimately, is on the platform above the block. So he can go there first, then jump down, then rewind back up to it. By the time the player gets to this point, he knows he's hot on the trail to fully solving the puzzle, so he's probably in a good mood. This extra step provides a little extra surprise at the end that the player was unlikely to foresee, and that adds a little bit more enjoyment, at least, hopefully. The idea for this level is that you need to bounce off this monster's head in order to get across this gap, but you probably killed the monster on the way up, so by the time you get to this platform here and can't figure out a way up, there is no longer a monster down there that you can see as a clue to what you should do. So the jump just seems plainly impossible. Suppose we're designing this level, how wide should we make this gap? This is an important decision with lots of nuances. Obviously, the gap needs to be wider than you can get just by jumping, because if it isn't, you can just jump across so there's no puzzle. How much wider should it be? One answer is barely wider so that it feels like you could almost jump across, but can't quite. You might imagine this to be a way of teasing the player, like, oh, you're so close. But there are problems with doing this. Firstly, as a designer, you have to always keep in mind that players don't know what you know. They're always at least a little more confused about everything. When they get to a level like this, they're not even sure there is a puzzle. If you give them a jump that they could almost make, the player's confusion is not going to be, aha, I cannot make the jump. This is a puzzle where I must figure out some other way across. Much more likely, he'll think, I almost made it. Maybe I jumped too early off that platform. Maybe if I run to the very edge and jump at the very last instant, I might be able to make it. And then this doesn't work, but the player knows his timing might still have been off, and this is an earlier level in the game, so he isn't super familiar with the timings and distances yet. So he'll try again and again, and maybe each try will take longer than you want, because even though rewind is in the game, it is quite common for people missing this jump to run all the way back to the left, climb the ladder, run to the right, and try again, because they aren't used to using rewind to correct non-deadly mistakes. So there would be some tedious attempts, and then the player is getting frustrated before starting to take seriously that there may be some other way to do it, and this starts things off on the wrong foot emotionally. Instead of a narrow gap, you might go for a super wide gap. Make the gap the maximum length you could travel by bouncing off the monster's head. You might think this would be good, because upon first sight, the player knows he just isn't going to jump that gap normally. Or even if he makes one jump attempt, that is certainly enough. He didn't come anywhere close to making it. So he won't have this frustrating experience of trying repeatedly that we just described. But maybe too much certainty is bad. There's not a whole lot you can do in this game, so maybe we're making the puzzle too obvious if the player knows on first sight he absolutely cannot jump that gap. Maybe the wide gap will attract so much attention that he will see the problem earlier, maybe much earlier, before he kills the important monster. But a bigger problem with a maximum wide gap is execution skill. Ignoring any idea of trying to get up to the ledge, it's already a bit hard just to jump down and hit the moving monster below. If the gap is extremely wide, you would need to perform that bounce when the monster is at exactly the maximal extent of your jump, which greatly limits the range of situations in which you can be successful, and timing must be very, very precise. You'd end up in a situation where a lot of players might be trying the right solution, but still miss the jump by quite a lot. What happens then? Remember, the player always knows much less than you do. He may conclude that this isn't the solution either, and then try to think of something else, and when no better idea comes, he may give up, because failure here looks a lot like failure in the case of, say, horizontally jumping with no monster. He just didn't succeed in getting onto the far ledge, but there's no real clarity of what went wrong, since the right answer is a mystery. Even if the player doesn't discount this solution, you've still made success in the puzzle highly contingent upon mastery of running and jumping, and tedious use of rewind to try again and again. And is this really what the game is about? What experience do you really want players to have? At the start of development, I didn't have a clear picture of all this, but as I worked on levels, I formulated clearly the idea that I want puzzles to be solvable mainly by understanding the core idea, with execution being relatively easy once you had that idea. And once you have the idea, you should know that the idea is right and not be confused about it. This is easier said than done. Because the game is based on action mechanics, sometimes it is hard to tune things to meet this ideal. But I tried, and this puzzle is one example. I sized this platform wide enough that you clearly can't make it in one jump, but close enough that very sloppy execution of a monster bounce is good enough. But this gap being on the shorter side of the spectrum between the two possibilities, I do think sometimes players jump repeatedly to try and cross it because it is not so wide as to dispel all doubt immediately. So maybe it should have been a little bit wider. If you bounce off this monster's head, starting from somewhere on its own platform, it seems almost like you can reach the platform on the upper right where you're trying to get. Tim's arm gets to about the middle of that platform. As far as I'm concerned, that's a bit too close, and I'd like a way to fix that. We might try to move the platform you're standing on further left, but we can't because you'd have to move it so far that the actual good jump that solves the puzzle becomes impossible or nearly so. You might notice that the third floor of this puzzle is quite expansive compared to the first and second floors, and say, hey, why didn't you just move the third floor upward a bit, shrinking the height of that level and expanding the height of the second floor so the place you're trying to get is clearly too high? But the problem with that is, in the natural process of solving the puzzle, the player will kill the first 3 monsters and keep trying to jump off the 4th one to cross the gap, and I wanted the player to feel like he has plenty of room to jump around, not bumping his head on the ceiling all the time, because that would make the experience of trying to solve this puzzle more frustrating. Being physically blocked all the time or bumped around when things are already going badly can be mildly rage-inducing. That said, the ceiling right above the gap is a bit lower than the ceiling to its left in order to provide wider puzzle tolerances to make it more obvious that this is not the right solution. So the player does bump his head here, just not very much, and hopefully not in a frustrating way. The top row also needs space because you want enough room for the player to jump and not leave the top of the screen. And the HUD is up there, and it gets awkward if the HUD is covering your gameplay. We could have added more space and caused the screen to scroll vertically, but this level is just much better when you can see the whole thing at once. So, even though I was not happy with how high the player can bounce from this monster, I didn't see any solution that wasn't worse than the problem, so I left it as is. David mentioned doing an initial, darker version of the World 3 art, and that we then had a discussion about it and changed direction. When I realized that it felt wrong for what I was trying to do with the game, this seemed like a pretty uncomfortable conversation to have. There was a fair amount of art done for World 3 already, and it's a pretty negative thing to say, hey, stop, we have to redo this, and not use the work you've done on it so far, especially when you think the other party may not understand why you want to redo it, because what's there looks fine. Fortunately, David was a good sport about it, and before too long, we got to the current World 3. Since then, I've become familiar with this kind of activity. It's a basic part of my job and happens a couple of times every game. If you're trying to make something that feels well put together, while successfully doing something subtle with mood or theme, it can actually be quite delicate, and it's easy for a bad ingredient to ruin the soup. Someone has to be tasting this soup and occasionally say, no, this ingredient isn't the right one to get where we are trying to go. Another such conversation came up later on that was even harder. Before David had come on the project, when I was having a hard time finding an artist to do everything, I worked for a bit with Edmund McMillan, who has since become well known for games such as The Binding of Isaac and Super Meat Boy. Back then, both he and I were unknown, He was working on other projects with the majority of his time, but he did art and animation for all the characters, which was very helpful in terms of making the game something better looking that people could actually play. After this, David came onto the project and did a larger volume of art for all the level's foreground and background objects. This took quite a while, and when it was done, I felt like I had a serious problem in that the game's overall art style was not coherent. Edmund's art is in a cartoony style, and David's looks like you see today, and the two just didn't mesh well together. They didn't create a uniform feel. I agonized over this for a bit, then said, "Hey, David, we need you to paint over Edmund's stuff in order to make the visuals uniform." And I informed Edmund of this as well. Most of the resulting characters hew closely to Edmund's designs, except for Tim, for whom we went through several revisions because I felt his look was key to the mood of the game. I felt bad that we painted over Edmund's stuff, but with years of hindsight, it was still clearly the right decision. But I suspect that a lot of newer independent developers would not have conversations like this because they're uncomfortable and may cause drama. It's much safer just to avoid the conflict and just roll ahead with the game that you have. But when it's the right thing for the game, you really should do it. Suppose we're early in the design process and we're deciding how exactly time should work in this world. What happens if you're standing still on a moving object like a cloud? Should time go forward or not? You're not moving of your own accord, so maybe time should not pass. But you are standing on a cloud that has a forward speed, and that would be carrying you forward, causing you to move. So maybe time should pass at the same rate as it would if you were walking at the speed of the cloud. But if what causes time to pass is your actual change in position and you are not moving yourself, then even though the cloud has some speed, it has no time for that speed to turn into a change in position, which is what would move your body. So maybe time should not pass. How do we decide? We started with the idea time moves when you move. But now that we are looking at specific cases, we have to zoom in and really decide the details. This is common in experimental game design. A big part of designing the game is making decisions about how things act at a fundamental level. Doing this well is an art of its own, so it's hard to explain how to do it generally. Each case is a bit different, and the various minute details of your particular case, leaning this way and that, weighted more or less heavily depending on what you value, determine the proper outcome. That's one reason why I wanted to provide so much detail in this commentary. The specific details are custom to Braid itself, but perhaps some players can see how we practice the art of decision-making beneath all the details and can take what they want of that philosophy and apply it toward their own pursuits. Anyway, what players see in a game are the concrete events that occur over time, and as a game designer, you are in some way designing those events. But you're doing it indirectly by designing the rules that give rise to the events and environments in which those rules act. What's important is the way those rules interact with player inputs to make interesting situations. To determine whether a rule is good, you look at the potential consequences of that rule in terms of the resulting events that occur during gameplay and try to predict what happens, or, when appropriate, actually implement the rule and see what actually happens. But we all have way too much work to do and can't implement everything, so at least some initial ground has to be covered solely in the designer's mind, judging ahead of time which rules are good. Then we can explore the most promising of these by implementing them. But even after you have many years of experience, predicting consequences could be pretty hard. A significant part of the beauty in the art of game design comes from surprise. Good rule sets generate surprise, both for the player and also for you, the designer. They give you more out than you put in. This means that the best rules can't be accurately judged in advance of being implemented. If you knew everything about them, they wouldn't be able to give you more back out than you put in. And that means that you're not tapping into the deep well of surprise that the universe makes available. So, making good decisions about the nuances of rules is greatly facilitated if you can perform actual experiments and see what surprises happen by programming a primitive version of the idea and playing around with it. In this case, whether time should pass when you're standing on a cloud, after some thought and some experimentation, I decided that time should only pass in response to direct player input. The time can be amplified by riding on a cloud or other platform, but no time will pass unless your character initiates the move. Why did I choose this? Firstly, when you're just walking on solid ground, everything is still unless you move. With the visuals and the audio, this creates the impression of a world that is frozen, but that reacts to your slightest move, and this impression is very strong. Since Braid is about different worlds, where each world has its own character, we don't want to weaken this character. Turning off the primary feature of the world as soon as you stand on a cloud or platform seems like a bad choice. It would weaken the impression of that world relative to the others. Although, maybe not too badly, since most of the time you're probably not riding on things. With the current rule set, when standing on a platform, you have 3 choices with respect to speed: time paused, time going backward, time going forward. The relative speed of backward and forwardness can be controlled by setting the speed of the platform. In general, analog differences are weak in puzzle games. Discrete differences in the play situation are much stronger. Puzzles feel better when actions are crisp and delineated by separate states. So, the version of the rules with 3 discrete states, forward, stopped, and backward, is probably better for puzzles than the one with 2 discrete states and an analog difference, fast forward, and slow backward. Though, this could be seen as subjective and a matter of taste. These are some of the reasons why I made this decision the way I did, but there are lots of other reasons too, and many of them are pretty subtle. This is common. This kind of decision-making involves weighing a bunch of factors at various levels of importance and with varying levels of clarity. Then you keep working on the game, and as the game changes, sometimes the right decision changes. You keep doing this until you get something you're happy with, or as close to happy as is possible at the time. In this world, time moves as you move. You move to the right, time goes forward. You move to the left, time goes backward. Usually you're running on solid ground, but what happens if you're riding on a platform that is itself moving? If you're walking to the right, time for the world goes forward because of your motion. So the platform, being part of the world, moves right. Since the platform is carrying you, it takes you even further to the right than you would have gone if you were just walking. So time should go forward even faster because your speed through the world is faster than walking speed. If you're walking to the left, time goes backward in the whole world, and the platform, being part of the world, goes left now because right was forward for the platform, left is backward. This carries you further to the left, which makes time go backward even faster than on solid ground. So interestingly, time goes faster in both directions. Riding on a moving object acts as an amplifier of the amount of time that passes, both forward and backward, as long as the object is moving to the right when time is forward. If the object is moving to the left when time is forward, it works against your walking speed, so it reduces the amount of time that passes, so you go more slowly, again, both forward and backward. Since before you get to this world, the game involves riding on lots of moving objects, the game would be incomplete if it didn't explore the interaction of platforms with the world for time behavior, and the player would miss out on some weird moments. In this level, I wanted the player to interact with a surface moving forward and a surface moving backward. I wanted them close to each other so you could see both moving at once. Usually in this game, the platforms you ride on are short, but the speed up or slow down effect would only happen momentarily on a short surface because you would walk off the surface pretty quickly, and that would be disorienting due to the rapidly changing speeds, and it would be harder for the player to understand what's happening and harder for us to make puzzles with. So I needed a way to make long platforms. Here I did that with cannons shooting clouds at a very fast rate, though on the right side of the level we have a comically large cloud that floats by for no apparent reason. There are also some technical issues involved in making this all happen, doing the programming and working out the math, that are pretty interesting. There's something about the sound effects when you pick up puzzle pieces that many people probably don't notice. There are different sound effects for different puzzle pieces. Games of Braid's era, like many games today, would play a condescending sound when you get to a collectible that says something like, "Hey, congratulations, you should feel really good about what you just did. You solved a puzzle. Good job." I hold great disdain for games that give you big ego-inflating fireworks shows just for finishing simple tutorial levels, So I didn't want the puzzle pieces to be anything like that. But there should be a sound that is significant because success should be acknowledged, and the collection of a puzzle piece is an important change in gameplay state. For a long time, I felt that I wanted the attitude of the sound effect to be kind of neutral, acknowledging that you did something that you could consider pretty good and it's probably significant, but not blowing it out of proportion or trying to stroke your ego. Things that are simple should be treated like they're simple, and things that are complex should be treated like they're complex. During the last year of development, in keeping with the theme that arose with the flags and with the ending of the game, it occurred to me that more ambiguity could be added into these puzzle piece sounds. They can indicate that you're making progress, but maybe that progress is not so positive. So I asked Harry Mack, who was working on sounds at the time, to come up with something reminiscent of happy casual game sound effects, but that felt uneasy and foreboding. There are 6 different effects because if I don't want to be like a condescending game, I want the magnitude of the sound effect to match the magnitude of the achievement. It's very easy to get the puzzle pieces in the beginning, so they should not have big sound effects. But puzzles that took a great deal of effort to get should not have tiny sound effects. I decided to break the sounds into 6 difficulty levels. I judged the difficulty of each puzzle piece and assigned the appropriate effect. Here are the 6 puzzle piece sound effects. Of course, these difficulty categorizations are inexact. What's easy for some people is hard for others, which is something I saw very clearly watching people playtest this game. So I don't take these difficulty ratings too seriously. What's easy for some people is hard for others, which is something I saw very clearly watching people playtest this game. So I don't take these difficulty ratings too seriously.
Trivial or difficult. I mean, sure, it's obvious to say, like, yeah, this is trivial because you could just use spacebar, hop over. And
sure, yeah,
get
at the
it
very
and,
beginning it's obvious.
Yeah.
But you mean for later puzzles?
Mm-hmm.
It depends. Some things are easier to judge and some things are harder to judge. So for example, we had this thing where we were talking about the last level in World 3, which has all these convoluted pathways and you have to figure out all the timings and all the things and dodge all the monsters. So that's automatically not easy because you have to do a lot of stuff just to get the thing. And then in addition to that, there's also stuff to figure out. So that is pretty clearly in the hard category. But some puzzles, you know, especially things toward the middle, some people find really easy and other people find hard. And it doesn't even necessarily correlate to anything. Like one person might find puzzle A easy and B hard, and another person might find puzzle A hard and B easy, right? But you could still sort of attempt in your mind to statistically weight that. Well, that's probably still harder than an easy puzzle. And if it's very hard for some people, maybe it should just be categorized as very hard, and then people who got it easier can feel better about themselves. Sort of the exemplar of that kind of thing that could be very easy or very hard for different people is the kind of puzzle where there's not much to do, but you just have to realize something that the game doesn't hint at very much. So for example, what I think of as the hardest puzzle in the game is this thing where you have to do like a really high jump. We talked about it in other commentary, and there's really not very many steps. There's like 2 steps to the puzzle. So it's not hard that way, but it is very hard for most people to figure out what to do. Some people maybe got it relatively quickly. I don't know. It depends on whether they thought about the key idea for the level, right? And I like that kind of puzzle. That's the kind of puzzle that's about epiphany, which happened a little bit in Braid and a lot more in The Witness. And I really like that kind of sudden realization puzzle. But the thing is, those often can be pretty hard.
Did you change anything after seeing playtesters go through it?
Yeah, I mean, I talk about this elsewhere, so I won't go into too much detail, but the one main thing that I changed from playtesting, there were a couple, actually. So there was a thing with a bunch of platforms, like World 2 in general. used to be a lot harder because I was like, well, you have rewind. And so it's like about trying not to die and stuff. And just by watching people play it, I was like, yeah, this really isn't that fun. Like anyone can make something really hard. So it's not that fun. So I narrowed down the number of places in which it's hard and got rid of some stuff that was kind of funny. The other one major thing that I changed was a mistake. And it was, there were a few ways this came out the way it is. But, in World 2, there's a puzzle and there's a platform there. And there's some puzzle pieces that obviously you should be trying to get. And you can't actually get them with the first time you get there. You have to go further and get very specific puzzle pieces that help you solve the puzzle. Now, there are a few reasons that happened, and some of them are a little bit different. But one of the reasons is just because I saw people play the game early on and refuse to keep going if they couldn't figure out a puzzle. And I was thinking, oh, I want to communicate to people that if you're stuck, you can move on and do other things. And what better way to do that than have a puzzle that there's no real way that you could figure out to solve, right? And then you could come back to it later when you've done everything else and have a better feel for the game. And you're like, what was the deal with this one? And that was kind of bad because I think the thing that's weak about that puzzle is that it's the only one in the game that you can't solve right away. And so, the two related puzzles. And that's actually bad because it's actually a quite good property for a game to have, to be solvable right away anytime you see a puzzle piece. Like, oh, I can get to that. I don't need to find the grappling hook or unlock double jump or something, right? So, yeah, that was bad. Sometimes you can ruin your thing from playtesting. I would claim that most companies do ruin their game by playtesting.
Yeah, I can see that. I definitely struggled with that particular world because I was determined to get that puzzle. Yeah, that's hard. It makes sense that people would just want to keep going to see what else is out there. It's kind of like when you're taking a test and you might get more information about a previous problem that you were struggling with. Maybe keep going. So that's why people do it.
Yeah, but this was definitely a case where I saw one person just banging his head against the puzzle. It was probably a different puzzle even, right? Because the layout of the worlds was a little bit different and whatever. And I just saw him having a hard time and refusing to go on. And I was just like, look, I designed the game so you can just walk to all the other puzzle pieces. It's fine. Just go. I mean, I didn't say that because I don't comment when people are playing. I don't know. That made me decide to do things a certain way. And I don't know that it was the best outcome. Although I say elsewhere in the commentary, I'm also not sure how to have done it better because there are other factors.
I mean, you just have to make every door into the next level locked, right? Until you get all the pieces if you wanted them to stay in that.
Well, that's how
spot.
most games are by default. And I didn't want that, right? Mm-hmm. So, because it's sort of a bad property for a puzzle game to have, to not let you play anymore if you can't figure out one thing. But, Portal 2 is like that, so people are used to it. So are most puzzle games ever made. Well, until recent, iOS-style games and stuff will do a thing where it's you need so many stars to get to the next level, and that requires only beating half the levels or something. When I set out to art direct Braid, I had a clear idea in mind that the foreground and background should be very distinct so you were never confused. Foreground objects would have well-defined, sharp details, whereas background objects would have a different palette and bigger, rougher strokes. The goal of this was to make it unambiguous what you would collide with. But there are some paradoxes built in. For example, doors are drawn as foreground objects even though you don't collide with them, because they are activatable things with very important functionality. I think it's fine and the doors are not a big problem, but I did feel after Braid had shipped that I had made a mistake with the puzzle frames. Because the puzzle boards are interactive, Their frames were drawn like foreground objects with crisp details, just like things you can stand on. But here in World 2, we very explicitly have puzzle pieces you're trying to get where you'd like to be able to stand on top of the puzzle frame. And it looks like you should be able to, but the player has to experiment to discover he just falls through. This is perhaps frustrating in an unnecessary way, because this is exactly the kind of thing that the visual language of a game is supposed to take care of. In the Anniversary Edition, we've changed the visual treatment of puzzle frames to avoid this problem. On these hunt levels, having a HUD like this is just the kind of weird idea that could happen when you're sitting down to make a game and don't know what it is yet. What are some fun things I could do in a game with rewind? Well, what if there are some monsters and you have to kill all of them for some reason to unlock a gate, and then this is challenging in some way and you can rewind when you get it wrong? At the time this idea was formed, there was not that much else in the game yet, but as I continued designing, I found I was able to generate a lot of interesting situations just using the rules of time behavior with the basic objects in the game, like the monster, the claw, and so forth. And that's good, because introducing special objectives like hunt that don't have anything to do with the way time behaves is pretty messy design-wise, because why add more ideas than you need? And it dilutes the strength of the game. Because if the game is supposed to be about manipulating time, what are all these ideas that are not really about time at all? I gravitated toward the cleaner, better kind of design as I proceeded, and the game became clearly structured as a set of worlds where rules are consistent across each world. So, whereas these hunt levels seemed fine in the beginning, in the final game, they're pretty weird. If I had been exercising a great deal of design discipline, I might have removed the hunt levels completely. But I didn't, because I like them, and I like the little spark of random creativity that they represented. Also, the reprise of Hunt in World 4 brings an elaboration that is really unique and interesting, and is very much about the rules of time, which makes it a great contribution to the core of the game. I think it is one of the best levels in the game. If I had never come up with the World 4 Hunt idea, and it had just been the World 2 version, I would have been much more likely to cut it from the game, but the full set of level and reprise was just too good. But I did take steps to further integrate the monster hunting and make it seem less arbitrary. In early versions of the game, there was just the HUD with no gate or puzzle piece, and when you hunted down all the monsters, it would just let you go to the next level. But to make the activity seem more like something happening in the world that's consistent with the rest of the game, and not just a constraint imposed by some immaterial HUD, I made a type of gate that was activated by monsters instead of keys, and the monsters are drawn on the gate too and get crossed off every time you kill them. Once this was in, it was kind of redundant to show the monster tally both on the gate and the HUD, but the gate is pretty small, so it helps to have the HUD remain as a bigger display that's easier to read. And also, yeah, I still like this idea of having a weird, quirky, mission-based HUD popping up. I didn't want to get rid of it. It was charming. Even though the gate kind of integrates the monster hunting idea with the world, from a game design standpoint, it is still weird to have a specific kind of gate that only shows up in one level. It's even weirder than having the HUD. At least the lair levels also have a HUD, but no other level in the game has a monster counting gate. If I were to redesign this level to try to be more consistent with the rest of the game, I would maybe just give each monster a key and there would be 6 gates at the top of the level and you have to open them all. They would be normal gates, not weird monster counting gates. This would avoid any necessity to have to count monsters in an artificial way, but it is likely to make the World 4 reprise messier and ruin the unrewindable key surprise in Fickle Companion, so ultimately I decided not to do this, even as a gameplay experiment in the Anniversary Edition. A multi-key version of this level would open up the question of what happens when you try to carry more than one key, which otherwise did not come up until much later in the final game.
Having 6 monsters in that level, or it's just an arbitrary number.
It was just the amount that felt good. Like, if you have 3, that's not very much. You're not really hunting that many monsters. Like the original idea, like the trick of the level even came a little bit after the initial idea. The initial idea was just like, how do I make an interesting level where you have something to do. Okay, go squish a bunch of monsters, right? And then I was like, okay, how do I make this more challenging? Or how do I make this something less stupid than the obvious thing? And that's when I came up with the trick for the level. But yeah, why 6? I mean, there aren't a lot more than 6. Like, I'm pretty sure there's one on every platform, right? So on the bottom floor, there's one, the player you come in. And then there's 2 up from that, because there's the monster that you have to keep alive. And then to the left of that, there's like just one occupying that platform. And then there's a platform above that with one that you were bumping your head with.
Yeah.
And then in the upper right, there's one. And then on top. So really the answer is there's one per platform. And so then the question is, could you have less than that? Like, could you have fewer platforms or something? And the answer is the minimal number of monsters to have this level exist is like 2. There's like the one that's the trick that you bounce off, and then one at the top that you have to get to, right? That's obvious though, because like there's not any other way to get up there if you don't bounce off that guy. So it's a kind of camouflage, but it's actually even a little bit different than that. There's a thing that I do a lot in the game where I lull people into doing the wrong thing by suggesting that they do something. That something that I'm suggesting is wrong. And if you're really sharp and like plugged in, you might even realize that it's wrong before you do it. But usually people don't, right? In this case, what I'm doing is suggesting that people should be stomping on monsters. Firstly, because there's a freaking HUD telling them to do that, right? And then secondly, because what else are you going to do if you like walk in the level and there's a ground floor with obviously nothing going on? I don't need this monster to get anywhere because there's a ladder going up, so I could just squish him, right? And you get in the mood to squish all the monsters. And so I'm sort of setting people up, right? And you need a certain number to set people up. But if there's too many, then it's too many, you know?
What inspired you to design the rabbits? And why are they so cute?
There were a few thoughts, right? So at first I'm like, I need more stuff in this game because I was trying to be minimal about it. And I felt like just having a little linear monster and a cannonball and a cloud was like not quite enough for the full game. But I didn't want to go crazy and add a bunch of things. So I was thinking about it like is there a hierarchy of stuff? Well, also the little claw plant that goes up and down, right? So, okay, there's a monster that basically doesn't move. It just goes up and down. There's one that moves linearly and could fall off platforms. But neither of those like makes decisions. Like neither is like running code to do things in the way that used to be called AI, although that's becoming a very confusing term. So I wanted something that makes different basic decisions. And then why is it a rabbit? Well, I mean, like a lot of little nerdsters, I liked Monty Python and the Holy Grail when I was a kid. So this is like have you seen this movie? Are you too young to know this movie? Okay. So there's a very dangerous rabbit in that movie. And it's funny. And it's one of those things that you grow up and you're like, oh man, that's really funny. And so, you know, when you're making a game, you kind of want to do the things that you like. And so it was just easy to do that. It's also sort of crossed, you know, the name for that entity in the code is mimic because it like looks like a flower and there are non-mimic flowers in the game as well. And so it's a way of psyching people out that was fun, borrowed from RPGs. And yeah, I don't know. It's really not that much more complicated than that. The most reasonable solution to this level that we hope players will find involves setting up the timing for the plants so that monsters can walk freely through all 3 of them. But it's a little weird because this solution only makes sense if you clearly understand 2 things. 1, that each plant moves on a consistent cycle that doesn't change over time, which might seem obvious, but the game never states this in any way, and the player didn't need to know this in earlier levels when he was just trying to run through, so it's likely he just hasn't thought about it. And 2, that these particular plants happen to have the same cycle as each other, just offset from each other in time. Because if they didn't have the same cycle, then after you set up any specific timing, the pattern would disintegrate quickly. This might make it pretty hard to think about setting up such a pattern in the first place, because you might not see the underlying constraint that makes it make sense. If you're very used to playing video games, these realizations might come to you quickly, or you just might not even have to think about it. But people without so much game experience can be at a big disadvantage when it comes to puzzles like this. It's also perhaps a bit unsatisfying that the solution involves synchronizing the plants in a certain way, but the timings are offset from each other, so the final motion lacks order and doesn't communicate correctness, as opposed to a visually synchronized bobbing up and down in unison. I don't exactly remember, but I think I did this to make it harder, like finding the combination to a lock. You don't want the combination to be 111, or your stuff will get stolen. But the level might have been better if the combination were 111. You might imagine retuning the level so that a solution involves clearly synchronizing the plants with each other, which would make the solution more satisfying and would probably help people understand what they're trying to do in the first place. There are no plant monsters in these levels that lead to the finale because it wouldn't be very interesting. When time goes forward, the plants just move in periodic cycles. There's some time when they're out and deadly, and some other time when they're tucked away and safe, and then transition times during which they're also mostly deadly. When time goes backward, they would just go through the same cycles backward, which would not make any meaningful difference to gameplay. It would be almost exactly the same, except when the transition times are asymmetric and whether the snapping sound plays when the claw is going up or down. Who really cares about that, I thought. Now, there are plant monsters in the final level, but they're used just to constrain the pacing of that level in the same ways they might be used elsewhere in the game. But the behavior difference is mainly cosmetic, and at the time, I felt this wasn't good enough for the earlier levels, which are supposed to be about behavior differences, just like all the other worlds in the game. That said, in retrospect, it seems like I missed an opportunity for a fun intro level to this world. You could imagine you've just entered this world for the first time, and you see just these plants, and you got to get through them, and they're simulating backwards so that it looks and feels weird. But because it behaves the same as plants earlier in the game, you pretty much play it the same. Maybe the player doesn't even realize what's going on yet, that time is going backwards. And so that's the point of the level, to introduce the world in a way that is subtle and weird. I mocked up this idea, and you can see that over here. There aren't any levels with rabbits in World 1 because it didn't seem to add much to the concept, and frankly, it would have been really annoying to program, and maybe I don't even know how to make it make sense. The simpler monsters are relatively easy to program a backward simulator for because they mostly just walk in a straight line. On the other hand, the rabbits make decisions about what to do based on where the player is. For example, if the player is at a certain range of distances, they decide to jump in an attempt to kill the player. In order to make this kind of decision backwards in time, the code for the rabbit, which has to just be normal code running forward in time because the computer's not magic, that code would have to say, "It is plausible that I would have jumped toward the player, but missed, landing in the place where I am now, so let's do a big jump backwards." The rabbit has to have missed because if he didn't, the player would already be dead, which the player isn't. The rabbit would do his small little hops backward away from the player, which means you could push rabbits around the level, which would be neat. But it is hard for this to have meaningful consequences because they can't die or kill any other monsters. They're all simulating backwards, so they could only undie. And it just seemed messy and clumsy to try to come up with situations where rabbits were, for some reason, unkilling monsters. In the game before this, rabbits almost never kill monsters. And we would have to then somehow make it that the player can't just jump on those monsters himself, which is a very challenging level design constraint. Because if the player could just jump on those monsters himself, we don't need the rabbits at all, and this would make the puzzle feel very broken. Maybe if the simulation were mixed, and some monsters were running forward and others backward, interesting situations could be made, but I was doubtful the puzzles would be good, and this didn't match what I'd wanted to do story-wise, which was just to have all of World 1 moving uniformly backward relative to the player. The reason for that is, I had designed the final level with the princess first. These first few levels of World 1 then just had the task of getting us to that final level. Since the final level is not about monsters with mixed directions through time, it would have been defocusing to do that in the introduction and then anticlimactic not to use them in the final level. So, the whole idea of adding backwards simulating rabbits just seemed like a big mess that would not yield much good, so I made the judgment call that it wouldn't be worth even trying all this. When you're working on a game like this and have too much to do all the time and need to do huge amounts of work just to get the game done in any form, sometimes these judgment calls are necessary. But sometimes these guesses that the work would not yield good results are wrong. Maybe it would have made for exciting and interesting levels, and there would be a fun world one involving stuff that simulates in both directions. There could be more levels in this world that use reversal interestingly with other object types. For example, unlocked gates that you walk up to in order to unbreak a key, locking the gate, which now blocks monsters because it's locked, and allows you to use that key elsewhere, on a gate that is unrewindable so you could open it. Except, all this doesn't quite make sense, because the key would not be able to open things unless it was unrewindable itself, because opening things would require the key to be moving forward in time. But if the key is unrewindable, you wouldn't be able to pick it up in the first place because it would be going forward in time, not backward. It would stay broken. But the gate that key had unlocked would still close and block monsters, which might be interesting. Sometimes, when you start with an idea like this, it doesn't quite work, but you keep thinking about it and experimenting, you eventually find a version that will work. So, there may be a good idea hiding somewhere in that key thing, or there may be other situations that would work more naturally. But I did not think of them at the time, so I didn't do them. This level from the original prototype became the level you're now inside, the pit. The basic idea of the level is still intact. There's a key in a pit, you jump in to get the key, and maybe that's as far ahead as you thought about things, and now you're stuck, and then there's a surprise as you rewind and the key comes with you. The original level in the prototype had a bunch of monsters in it. It didn't fit all on one screen. It was more like 2 or 3 screens. And you had to climb up and go around to get to the pit. There was no graphical effect on the key like there is now. It's just, when you rewound, the key always came with you. And in fact, all keys in that prototype magically came with you when you rewound. We just didn't introduce any keys until World 3. It was only later that I had the idea that unrewindability could be a property placed on any object. The more I worked on Braid, the more I realized that focusing levels down, distilling their geometry into something more minimal, helped the player to see the ideas behind levels and to make plans of how to solve them. And when this was done, the experience of solving a level was stronger because the solution wasn't hidden behind a bunch of busywork steps or obscured by extra level geometry. Everything you needed was right there, stark on the screen. When I first reduced the pit to this level of simplicity, I worried that it was too simple, but time showed it was the right decision. So if simplicity is so good, why couldn't I just start there? Why was the initial design more complicated? Well, it's because I was trying to be a good designer. It's a general rule of good game design that you want to encounter a locked gate before you find the key to open it. Otherwise, the gate was never a barrier, and getting the key isn't an achievement. The gate just opens automatically because, hey, you are holding some key, and you didn't know why you needed the key when you got it. You just picked it up because, of course. Whereas if you encounter a locked gate first, now you have an objective to guide your play through the rest of the level, trying to get the thing that will open that gate. Play is much more structured and purposeful. So I had given the level this tortured geometry in an attempt to satisfy the gate first rule. So you start at the entry to the level, you walk right, hit the gate, climb up, then left, then get the key, then come out and go back down to the gate. But this made the level convoluted and large. You couldn't see the whole level at once as you can now. As I continued to work on the game, I found that simplicity was much more important, and getting to the gate first wasn't strictly necessary, because if the level is small and simple enough, it's easy to notice the gate is right there on the screen. You see it as soon as the level loads, and obviously you need to get past it. You can also see the key right there on the screen, and you know you'll need to pick that up. So, this is a case where following the rules of good game design made the level much worse than it needed to be. So I like this version much better than the old one, but at the same time, the simplicity of this final design does confuse some people. The failure mode for people playing this level is pretty simple. They get stuck in the pit and don't think of using rewind to get out, and they just say, I'm stuck down here, there's obviously no way out. Sometimes people open the menu and exit back to the house. There is something about the geometry of the prototype, of hitting the gate, then having to go up and around, that maybe introduces you to the problem better, and that gives a slightly more solid impression that you should be able to come back whence you came. Hey, maybe there's something important back earlier in the level that I did wrong that I could rewind back to. Whereas, if the beginning of the level is just you jumping into the pit, and you can look and see there's nothing else back at the beginning, there seems to be nothing to rewind back to, and maybe no reason to think of rewind at all in the first place. Of course, I could have put up a hint that tells you to rewind if you stay in the pit too long, but this would run counter to the basic spirit of the game. I didn't want to ruin the magic of the moment by telling you what to do. The simplicity of this final design perhaps makes the moment of discovery more powerful. This is one of the first moments of real magic in the game, so it's important for it to be as simple as possible so it doesn't feel messy, contrived, or arbitrary, and so that you don't feel like you were deceived in some cheap way by a complex level. Why is there a monster in the pit? It's easy to kill and doesn't affect the outcome of the level. I've said the game is better when it's simpler, and wouldn't it be simpler just to have a pit with only a key in it? The player could just jump in, grab the key, and rewind out. Well, a mostly empty pit didn't feel right to me. I liked the idea of you having to do something in the pit, like jump on a monster, because otherwise it's obvious upon entering the level to just look ahead and see that once you jump into this pit, you can't get out. But if there's a monster down there, it can serve as an endpoint to the thought process. It's enticing to go jump on a monster. Maybe the player kind of thinks he might be able to bounce out of the pit, or who knows what will happen. There's something to do right now, and there's ambiguity about the future, so let's just do what we can right now. The version of the pit in the original prototype had 2 monsters in the pit in order to perhaps mislead the player a bit more into thinking he might be able to double bounce out. But I later decided this was unnecessary to create the endpoint for thought, and was also a bit unfriendly because it seemed to imply much more strongly that the right answer is to double jump. So the game is directly misleading the player into repeatedly trying something unfun. Whereas with a single bounce, it's easy to see that you did it well, and how high you went as a result, and that this is nowhere near the top of the pit. The presence of the monster was reinforced when I made the World 4 version of this level, because there the monster is crucial. Without it, I couldn't see any reason to have a World 4 version of the pit at all. And when there's a monster at the bottom of the pit every time, that creates a consistent pattern that we then break for the final pit in World 6. The final, and perhaps smallest reason for the monster is, I liked that I could start the monster away from the key so that he walks forward and grabs it, making a sound cue, which causes the player's attention to be drawn to that area at the bottom of the pit shortly after the level starts, right when the player is first looking around to figure out what to do. My very first conception of this world's mechanics was to do something like a black hole, where the rate of passage of time slows down toward the center, lightly inspired by the way black holes seem to work in the real world. This harkened back to the original idea of the game, before development really started, of translating ideas from relativity, quantum mechanics, and so forth into the human scale, a bit absurdly, and seeing what that looks like. Even in Braid's code, if you were to look, you would see that the ring is still called a black hole. How did it end up as an engagement ring for the final game? After all, it could have been anything. My first idea of how to manifest a black hole was that Tim would have some kind of sci-fi gadget that he would activate to create the time distortion effect. Insofar as the fiction is concerned, the time distortion would be a completely literal, hard sci-fi kind of device. But this felt wrong to me. The fiction of the game to that point had been more fanciful and metaphorical, so adding some kind of time disruption gadget just felt bad. It is very important to hone this sense of how your ideas feel when you consider them alongside the choices you've already made, combined into a hopefully coherent whole, and we'll talk about this in more detail elsewhere. To accord better with the game's fiction, and hearkening back to inspirations like Cosmic Comics, I wanted to make the device and the slowdown effect it creates less literal. The slowdown became hesitation and wariness, rather than fictionally a literal slowdown of time. It is inherently a literal slowdown for gameplay, so if it's also a literal slowdown in the fiction, we miss an opportunity to play with the idea. And at least to a first approximation, the more ideas you can wrangle with in your game, times the amount you can explore each idea, determines the mental depth and complexity of your game. But of course, one can take this too far or execute badly. Even though the slowdown became metaphorical, it felt important to maintain the physics motif of the game, thinking about forces like gravity in our real universe. Since the magnitude of a force emanated from a point would decrease by some function of the distance, the overall pattern of force has circular symmetry. At each distance, there is a circle in space where the force is at the same strength. This is why gravity compacts planets and stars into spheres. Thus it rhymed that the object that emanates the force would be a circle. From there, and considering the goal to make this object metaphorical, the idea of a ring fell out naturally. And as soon as I had that idea, I felt really good about it because, again, consulting my sense of how well the elements of the game are working together, I felt that the roundness of the ring was metaphorical in both directions. It represents a human commitment, but its roundness also represents physics itself in a more subliminal way due to the aforementioned radial symmetry of forces. You might think a sci-fi gadget would be more likely to say physics, but that is more of a surface level, trivial idea. A clean circular piece of metal is a deeper, more meaningful, more subliminal representative of the physics motif. Also, there's a feeling with this metaphor that it reaches beyond what I explicitly understand with my reasoning mind and dips into unconscious territory. There are things about this choice of representations that feel good that I don't completely understand. My goal in designing this kind of game is to reach beyond my surface level understanding, wherever possible. So anytime I feel this way about a choice, it means the game is getting better. After the ring was initially implemented, rather than a pure physical force that decreases by distance, for gameplay purposes I tuned the slowdown so that it becomes constant inside an inner radius. Once there's an inner radius where behavior is materially different, it is a good idea to draw that radius so that the player can see clearly the place where the slowdown behavior changes to make the game more understandable and playable. Once the game is drawing a big ring on the screen for this purpose, the circular motif becomes reinforced. When we're sitting down to design a game, we get to decide everything about how it works. So, we have the high-level idea that there should be an object you could drop to slow down time. How do we decide exactly how it should behave, down to every detail? The game was inspired by strange phenomena created by the laws of physics, and more specifically, the slowdown effect was inspired by time dilation that happens at very high speeds or in very deep gravity wells, so we can start our thought process there. Since we are dropping a localized object, it is much more reminiscent of gravity wells than high speeds. The thing about gravity, or any other physical force, is that it is proportional to 1 divided by the squared distance between the two objects exchanging the force. A simplified way of thinking about this 1 over r squared function is that it's happening because a given amount of force is produced at one place, then the waves or particles emanate out from that point in an ever-expanding sphere. As these mediating particles go out, their density decreases with the surface area of that sphere, which is proportional to r squared in the 3 dimensions of our world. 1 over r squared, and other functions like it, are continuous, so they change gradually with changes in spatial position. 1 over r squared changes very quickly when you're close to the origin, but very slowly in a way that creates only subtle analog differences when you get further out. Analog things are hard to deal with in puzzle games. In general, discrete things are easier for the player to reason about and easier for the designer to make sure the gameplay experience is clean and not fiddly and not weird. If the speed that you go at changes quickly near the center of the ring, and this speed is a big factor in how puzzles get solved, which it must be, the whole idea of the world is to slow stuff down by placing the ring, then the puzzles would be subject to a lot of fiddliness based on the exact position where the ring is placed. So if you place the ring right next to an object, that object might go at 0.1 speed, 1/10 of normal speed. But if you nudge the ring just slightly over, close enough that it might be hard for the player to intentionally choose distances at this scale, the object might now go at 0.2 speed, which is twice as fast, which makes it very hard to be consistent gameplay-wise. And if we don't limit the slowdown rate and just put a singularity at the middle, then slowdown would become infinite as you approach the center, which can become very awkward for gameplay. If you walk too close to the center or accidentally fell in vertically, it could take a very long time to get back out. And since you manipulate the ring by physically picking it up, and you'd need to be near it to pick it up, this set of game design choices drives us directly into the awkwardness. Anytime you're making choices and you see they result directly in an unpleasant situation like this, it's a sign you should change those choices. So it was clear to me, pretty quickly, that we wanted to limit the maximum slowdown and didn't want the maximum slowdown rate to be changing very quickly near the ring. What should the maximum slowdown be? We want it to be slow enough that you can see the effects in an obvious way, because that's very helpful when solving puzzles and also makes the game feel cool. But also, we want the ability to design levels with lots of tolerance. You want to be able to make puzzles with wide margins of player error when the player is executing the right solution, and this necessitates the slowdown amount to be pretty high. Also, and this may sound shallow, but I wanted the music and sound effects to sound cool as you walk through the slowdown area. At some basic level, the game is about seeing and feeling time distortion, so this may actually be less shallow than it seems. But if the maximum slowdown is too much, solving can become routinely tedious because it just takes too long to move through the affected space. And if the music plays too slow, you can no longer really hear it anymore, both because your brain no longer tracks sounds that are that slow in the same way as normal speeds, and because the sound waves lose most of their energy as they get stretched so far. So the music stops being cool and you don't get as much information about gameplay state from the sound effects. For all these reasons, I settled on an inner radius of the size you can see in the game with a max slowdown factor of 5 times. This inner radius is drawn clearly as a bubble when you place the ring. There is no maximum outer radius, and this is perhaps a design failing, because there's no way to use the ring to affect one object without it affecting everything on the level. This makes levels like impassable foliage much more difficult and messy than they might otherwise have been. But I didn't want to impose an outer radius because I wanted the ring to be as physics-y as possible, and that requires the effect to travel outward forever. Maybe it was a mistake, I don't know. Earlier we said that in 3D, the falloff would be 1/r², and that this would probably change too quickly. When I tried it, yeah, it changed too quickly. I also tried 1/r, which, in addition to being simple, is what would actually happen in 2D space, and I didn't like that either. Just going by game feel, I settled on a function involving 2 to the minus r. It is this. Boiling the function down to its simplest form, it's just 1 minus 0.8 times 2 to the minus x, where x is the number of radii away we are, and we clamp x at 0, which makes the slowdown constant inside the radius. Here's the code from the game that actually implements this. You can imagine how you might like to change this behavior and what the consequences would be. At the very first level of World 2, there's a few tutorial-ish things that are just like, here's some puzzle pieces that are kind of easy, that you do various things to get, just to show you the kind of things you do in this game, right? One of the very first ones was, there's one of these platforms that goes, I don't know if this was in the version that you guys play, it might have been.
You mean the first, like, alpha build?
Yeah.
Okay.
There was like a platform, you know, at the very end of what I'm about to say, there's a puzzle piece that you can see, and you're like, I need to get that.
Okay.
So there's a platform with a gap you have to jump across.
Right.
To a narrower platform.
Right.
with another gap to a narrower platform
Right,
with
yeah.
another gap to a
Yeah.
narrower platform with another gap. And there's like 9 platforms increasingly narrow. And like
Right.
the last ones are
Right.
absurdly thin compared to your character.
Yes.
Which is kind of bad because like even at that point, it's like you would stand on a platform or not based on whether the center point of your character was
Right.
located on the span of the platform, right?
Right.
So it's like, are you supposed to read the game's mind there? But that was like funny because there's no way you would do that in another game.
Right. Right.
That ended up getting taken out. In part, like Microsoft complained about it, but I was also like, yeah, that's been in the game since really early on, and it's no longer quite the quality of experience that I want to have.
Microsoft complained about it?
They did a thing, so in early 2008, when the game was
Okay.
getting close to kind of being done,
Okay.
they did a whole frickin' playtest lab thing about it, right?
Oh, okay.
And they decided to tell me, here is how you should change your game based on the results of the playtest lab. And I
Okay.
said, well, this would make more sense if I could see the raw data. And they were like, no, we're not going to send you any data. I, as the producer, am just going to give you my opinion about what you should do. And I was
Wow,
like,
right.
no.
Okay.
But I did change that one thing because it was like, you know, sometimes you already kind of know something's not that good. And it's like, all right.
Yeah.
Yeah. One problem that I see sometimes with Hunt is that people get up to the platform on the left here, and they've already killed the monster below as expected, so there's no visual sign of the right way to get across to the right. But there's a monster here on the platform with them. Or if they killed it already, as soon as they rewind, that monster is the first one resurrected. So a player might spend a long time trying to bounce off this monster as it walks over to the right side of the platform, because it's the only obvious possibility for solving the puzzle. The jump doesn't come anywhere close to getting you across, and you do bump your head on the ceiling for reasons explained here. So this approach can't work, but a player is likely to try several times frustratingly before trying something else, because there simply is no visual cue of any other way up there. Maybe that's fine. I thought so at the time. Hey, it's a hard puzzle, let people be a bit stuck. But now I wish I had encouraged players to be stuck in a cleaner way. The cleanest revision to try as a designer might be just to delete this monster so that the platform is empty. This messes up a subtle bit of symmetry of the level, that there's exactly one monster on every walkable surface, but it's probably worth it. But removing this monster would somewhat ruin the World 4 version of Hunt. You could bring back that monster only in World 4. Or you could do what I've done here, split this platform so that the monster still exists, but doesn't come anywhere near the gap you need to cross. This removes one major avenue of frustrating wrong attempts, which is maybe good. It makes the level easier, which is maybe bad. In the interview with Mark, we talked about separating this high jump puzzle into its own level to decrease confusion and to increase focus. This is what that might look like, and I think this version might have made the original game better. But the game as a whole consists of many levels with multiple puzzles on them and only a few levels with single puzzles. If I change this level to have only one puzzle, it would shift the game further in the direction of single puzzle levels, which would change how the game feels overall. But you could do that. You could imagine redesigning the whole game to have one puzzle per level. The result would feel pretty different, I think. Some puzzles would be easier due to increased clarity and focus, and that's probably good. But the game would also feel more like other generic puzzle games, which often have one puzzle per level. And some other basic functional things about the game would get uglier. For example, on the cloud screens, we would need to have a big row of 12 doors every time. Mark suggested making the puzzle easier by hinting that you need to make a monster bounce off your head. Here's the idea I came up with during that discussion. It works, but it's pretty ugly because of the weird geometry and the way the player is almost trapped on the left side of the level. In the rest of the game, you can just walk to the next level anytime you're stuck, except, of course, in the boss levels, where being locked in is part of the drama. So locking the player in here on a normal level is really not great. Not only because we're blocking the player's ability to experiment, but because we're diluting the uniqueness of the boss levels. One way that puzzle games end up being mediocre is when designers make stuff like this and just decide, hey, it's good enough. To really produce high quality work, you want to notice ugliness like this when it happens, to see all this weighty stuff has been added to the level, just to make an excuse to bounce a monster, and then ask yourself, can't I find a more elegant way to do this? Then you could try different ideas in your mind or in the level editor and judge to yourself whether they're becoming uglier or more beautiful. Every good puzzle designer I know practices this aesthetic sense in some way. The good news is that there isn't an objectively correct answer, which means you can develop your own personal voice and style. But without some strong idea of what's good that is reality-based to some degree, you won't really be able to make good puzzles. After making the previous level, I was dissatisfied with its ugliness. Remember that the goal was just a hint at the high jump solution by having you bounce a monster off your head. I worked on the level further and came up with this version, which provides a much simpler reason to do such a bounce. I think this version is obviously much better than the ugly one, but if I were to choose, I still like the first revision better, the single screen puzzle that has no hints. Here, we show various versions of the key passing puzzle so we can contrast them. This is the version of the puzzle that's present in the released game, but the solution is even more obvious here because the key is in a small area with a wall to the right, so the only possible way the key could go is to the left. In the actual game, the key is located next to the rabbit distraction puzzle where you can keep running to the right a little bit, and I did this intentionally to create a little more uncertainty about where to go with the key. You solve this puzzle by jumping across the pit so that the key almost makes it to the other side, but then you rewind and let your shadow do the jump while you stand in the proper place to receive the key. To solve the puzzle, you have to start your jump very close to the edge of the platform, which is a negative to me. I would like it if the puzzle gave you a lot more slack in terms of where to jump, which is part of a philosophy discussed over here. But if you as the designer size the pit so that the player can successfully jump from further back, then a more experienced player could instead run up to the very edge and jump and make it across the pit alive, which ruins the entire puzzle. So the pit cannot be very narrow. But even with a pit that you can't jump across, we still have the problem that because the key has to get far enough that you can grab it later, you have to be able to almost jump across. And this violates one of the core principles of puzzle design we mentioned in the link above, which is that if you aren't supposed to be able to jump across a gap, it should be clear that you can't do it to avoid player fumbling and frustration. You shouldn't even come close to making that jump, but you have to for the puzzle to work. To help mitigate this situation, I made the left side of the pit higher than the right. Now, when you attempt to jump, at the far side your feet are well below where they need to be to successfully land, so it's more clear that you just can't do it. But because the key is held higher than foot level, it still ends up in a good place. But I can't make the left side too high, otherwise it lets the player jump from the left to the right, which I also didn't want, because this makes the solution a little too obvious or trivial feeling. After all, if you just jumped over the pit to grab the key, of course you're going to try to jump right back. Also, in order for the puzzle to work well, when you do it wrong and jump into the pit and die, the key needs to fall to a position where the live player can no longer reach it. Otherwise, the timing element of the puzzle would be gone because you could grab the key anytime after the shadow jumps into the spikes. Getting the key more easily would not only make the puzzle less interesting to solve, it would sap drama and gravitas because these are much stronger when the about-to-die Tim desperately passes the key to the alive Tim. In order for this key passing to work at all, a rule had to be specified in the gameplay code. If the Shadow Tim is holding a key that's shared among both realities, and the live Tim intersects with that key, the live Tim takes possession from the Shadow Tim. Because the game is a simulation that should respond deterministically to all events that could happen in its world, the game must have some consistent rule about what happens in this case, but as the designer, you get to decide what that rule is. Maybe a more natural rule would be that whoever was already holding the key keeps it. But I wanted this specific puzzle to work, so I made the rule the way it is now. You could think of this extra rule as being a tiny blemish on the puzzle design, but given that the active reality already feels more important than the shadow reality, This rule may seem unsurprising to the player if he thinks clearly about it at all, which most players won't. This is the first version of the key passing puzzle that I thought of and implemented in the game. It's simple, and it doesn't require the somewhat precise jumping of the final version. Instead, you just pass the key through the little hole in the wall. But I didn't like it because it seems so obvious and contrived. Obvious because the hole grabs so much attention. I need to get this key from one side of the wall to the other, and what else would such a hole be for? When you solve the puzzle, it can't really feel magical because obviously that weird hole is there so you could put the key through it. Whereas, there are spike pits elsewhere in the game, so that pit's very existence didn't raise attention. That it seemed too contrived is a bit of a different thing than being obvious, but it's not totally unrelated. Because there are no small holes in thin walls elsewhere in the game, it's like we're adding a new concept into the level geometry that the player needs to recognize, but just for this puzzle, and we'll never see it elsewhere. I try to avoid this kind of thing in my designs because when you do this a lot, it makes the game feel weighted down and ugly. Here's a version of key passing where you can give the key to a monster who takes it through the tunnel for you. This is less weird than the previous version because such monster tunnels already exist throughout the game. This version of the puzzle seems too easy to solve by mistake, though. If your shadow is holding the key and accidentally gets killed by the monster, the key will naturally end up on the other side of the tunnel without you intending that to happen at all. When the player experiences an accidental puzzle solve, it can confuse him and reduce his confidence that the makers of the game have him in good hands, which can have consequences down the road. To decrease the odds of an accidental solve, here I've put extra monsters atop the various platforms to help put the player in the mood to stomp monsters. Because if the player casually stomps the monster that would have been the one going through the tunnel, obviously an accidental solve will not happen. The extra monsters also make the solution less of a blatant giveaway. It's not, hey, here is just one monster walking through this tunnel, it must be the answer. Another positive aspect is that this version gets rid of the special rule: if the shadow is carrying the key and the active player touches it, he takes the key away from the shadow. Here is a simpler version of the mimic distraction puzzle. I did think of this form of puzzle when designing the original game, but I felt it would be too easy to solve accidentally, or even when solving deliberately, it just wouldn't feel as strong. The aspect of the final design of having to enter a long passage from both sides necessitates more premeditation, and it just feels better to me. But that final design requires special programming to get the rabbit not to leave its area, because if he did go out from beneath the overhang, you could easily just jump on him and kill him. That is to say, this rabbit does not behave quite like the other ones, and the only reason for that is to implement this puzzle. Some designers would consider this a hack that acts as a mild blemish on the game. Here, to prevent the rabbit from being killed, we make the player climb up into a restricted area from which the rabbit cannot leave and cannot be attacked from above. Thus, no special programming hack is required. This initial cliff on the left is here because the rabbit chases you very slowly when you are far away. So, if you were able to wake him up and then walk to the left side of the level, you could coax him to walk all the way over to the left. Then you could successfully race to the ladder and win without using the parallel universe at all. Because that would break the puzzle, we prevent it. Today, with much more design experience, do I like this version of the puzzle better? Probably, as I'm more of a purist about these weird hacks. But there's still something enticing about the symmetry of you and your shadow entering a tunnel from opposite sides, having the rabbit chase you in opposite directions. I wonder if, by working on this further, I could come up with an even better version of this puzzle that retains that symmetry. Here's a version of elevator action that just implements the idea of the first puzzle, but without making any artful excuses for the level's setup. It's included here to show the usefulness of artful excuses. This version of the level is more minimal than the original, and I've said a few times elsewhere that when designing Braid, the simpler the levels got, the better they were. But this level is an exception. Here, simpler is worse because it gives away the answer to the puzzle, which destroys the magic. Imagine you're at the top of the level, you get the key, you realize you can't get back out through the cannonballs, What's the solution? Well, obviously it has to do with that elevator platform that has no other purpose. How could I use that? Well, this world is all about the ring. Oh, I'll just put the ring on the elevator. In the original level, the elevator has an excuse to exist. You ride it down to a side room where you get the key and fight a monster. Obviously, you needed to go down there to get the key, even though this is topologically the same as putting the key at the top. Also, the presence of a monster in a tight space can create a frantic experience that acts as a mental palate cleanser so that you're less likely to think, isn't it weird that there's an elevator just to go down to this useless room? Because the elevator had an obvious purpose, it becomes less conspicuous when you're thinking about how to get out. You don't really consider it as readily. Then when you realize the elevator is also the key to solving the puzzle, it's a positive surprise and there's magic to it. This is what I mean by an artful excuse. We gave the elevator a reason to exist that feels natural in order to make it less suspicious. When you design puzzles, opportunities for artful excuses will arise to varying degrees. If you don't notice these opportunities, that's one way your puzzles can end up mysteriously subpar in a way you don't feel you understand or have any power to improve. But once you see the opportunities, exploiting them well is another matter. It can be pretty hard to make excuses that really work and are not too ugly. And there's a fine line between an excuse and a red herring, the traditional name for a deceptive anti-hint that leads the player down the wrong path entirely. Red herrings usually indicate bad puzzles. Now, it is possible to mislead in a delightful way, but that's another discussion completely and is almost never what designers are doing when they add red herrings. Most red herrings are cheap, low-skill tactics. Anyone could add them at any time to any puzzle, and they make puzzles seem less fair and less clear, which weakens the puzzle and the game as a whole. But I hope you can see the situation here is something a bit different from a red herring, though it is related. Here's a simplified version of the level in another castle. The original is fairly complicated and difficult, involving the use of a floor that makes you rewind exempt. But because there are only a few of these in the whole game, you have only a small amount of experience with how they work, so it's more difficult to think through the solution. I had wanted this to be a fairly difficult puzzle because it's the final level before the endgame, and traditionally, difficulty goes up with time. And there are some good reasons for that, though we in the industry do tend to rely on this old habit a bit too much. Also, precisely because there aren't many of these rewind exemption platforms in the game, I had wanted to use another one here, because otherwise, if that game mechanic only happens once or twice, it feels pretty weird, like a one-off hack, rather than part of the overall system. But really the important, interesting, and cool thing about the level, the idea that inspired me to make it in the first place, is just the mental image of the ring and the key falling slowly together for a long time. These days I would be much more interested in making a level that focuses on that phenomenon specifically, without obscuring it by putting unrelated difficult stuff in front. So here's what that might have looked like. It is more focused, and also much easier. Braid is a somewhat short game. If all the puzzles were as easy as this one, maybe the game would feel less satisfying because you could blast through the whole thing without having to think very much. But you can structure a game to break ideas like this into multiple stages. First level, we show the cool thing with the key falling slowly, and you do have to think a little bit to solve that, but it's not too hard. Then, the next level is built around the idea of the key falling again, but with some augmentation that's interesting on its own. And there can be more challenge in the second level because the player's already familiar with the idea of the slowly falling key and can use that as a pre-understood building block in the solution. I didn't do much of this in Braid, though the reprise levels make this happen to a limited degree, but in later games I do it a lot. These days, I really like making sequences of puzzles where there's a flow of ideas from puzzle to puzzle, and that flow itself becomes observable by the player, and the sequence creates a more than the sum of its parts effect that can be quite sublime when fully appreciated. This level works because the ring itself falls slowly. But you could imagine that the field emanated by the ring might not affect the ring itself, only everything around it. Then the ring would fall at a normal speed. As a designer, how do you decide which way it should work? This level shows you exactly how I make this kind of decision. There's something really interesting that I could do if the ring affects itself, have it fall slowly with the key for a long time, and there's no equivalent interesting thing in the other case, at least Not that I could think of at the time or even now. This helps to sway the decision quite strongly. Because the ring acts on everything, including itself, for consistency, the sound effects played when the ring is manipulated are also affected by the time dilation. I decided to do this not just because it's internally consistent in terms of the laws of the world, but also because I wanted to further emphasize the change in time behavior with as many audio visuals as possible, and the ring's sound effect is very prominent at these times. In that first simplified version of this level, I dislike that the ring slows down not only the key, but also the platform holding the key up, because it means that the player could be thinking about solving the level just by slowing down the platform itself, delaying the initial time at which the key falls, which does actually make sense. So it's not like I can prevent that. But if the player is thinking about slowing down the platform, even if that doesn't by itself delay the key drop long enough to solve the puzzle, the key falling is de-emphasized in his mind. Here, I move the ledge where you place the ring down away from the platform so the ring starts falling quickly, then enters the slowdown zone. This is fine, but I don't really like it because the ring is not falling in parallel with the key all the way, which is the interesting and cool image that inspired me initially. We could attempt to fix this by making the platform unrewindable so it would not be slowed by the ring. But then, every time the player makes a mistake, he has to exit the level and come back, and that would be annoying, and it would also tread on the territory of the level irreversible, spoiling that level's uniqueness and defocusing the game. This is another case of design aesthetics at play. You make changes, you observe what's good about them, what's bad, and you try to come up with the best thing in the end. But for this to go well, you have to be astute and honest in observing what's bad. This is an actual skill you can improve, and then see if there's a way to refine bad things into good things. If not, you need to have the courage to dump the bad idea and to try to put something else in its place, even if you don't yet know what that might be. This is my first attempt at a subtle introduction to World 1 that's about maybe noticing that the plants go backward, as mentioned over here. I'm not sure it would have been the best way to introduce the world, as it would take longer for players before they see what makes time unique in that world, but we did it here just for illustration's sake.